it's actually a great force, and that force is karma. So karma in English, when it's translated, it means lust, but lust is sort of like a very specific term, right? But karma is a much broader term, which includes within it many different ways in which we engage or we get attached to our senses and the gratification of our senses. So it could be in the form of sensual physical desire. It can also be in the form of just desire for acquisition. So just wanting to get more and more and more and more stuff. And we see that how this is actually a situation where people just want to like fill up their houses, and yet it doesn't seem to fill up their heart. And then the third way in which lust manifests is very subtle, which manifests in the form of a great thirst for power and fame and honor and distinction. There was a little incident. So in India, for those of you who are not from India, there is this very famous Bollywood actor by the name Amitabh Bachchan, and he's like, the personification, right, of what would you say, Bollywood celebrityhood, And so every I don't know if he does this every day, but he comes on his balcony or whatever, and people assemble in downstairs just to get a glimpse of him. And people, when I say people, I guess it's probably hundreds of thousands of people, maybe they assemble. And so he was once asked this question, that what is your greatest fear? And his response was that my greatest fear is actually coming on that balcony one fine day and finding that there are less people.
Or there's nobody.
Or there is nobody. So the point being that this subtle desire for fame and honor and distinction is also a form of lust.
So Krishna ends the third chapter by telling Arjuna that that he should destroy this enemy by knowledge. Let's see what he says.
I'm going to try and put
thus knowing oneself to be transcendental to material senses, mind and intelligence, one should study the mind by deliberate spiritual intelligence, and thus by spiritual strength conquer this insatiable enemy known as lust. So how to develop this transcendental knowledge, and what is this transcendental knowledge? Therefore Krishna describes in the fourth chapter. So let's look at the verses. We'll just cover 3 verses tonight from the fourth chapter, and then we'll discuss them. So we'll recite the verses since we are only discussing 2 or 3. Shri Bhagavanu Vacha Imam Vivasvate Yogam Proktavanaham Avyayam Vivaswan Manave Praha Manurikshva Kavya Brave. Personality of Godhead Lord Krishna said, I instructed this imperishable science of yoga to the sun god Vivaswan, and Vivaswan instructed it to Manu, the father of mankind, and Manu in turn instructed it to Ikshvaku. So we'll just explain just a little bit what's going on here. So Krishna says this imperishable science of yoga, he instructed it to the. So in the sun, there is a person who is in charge of the sun planet, and he's called the sun god. His name is Vivaswan, and he's very, very old. I mean, old in the sense that his lifespan is much greater than what we can imagine. And Vivaswan instructed this science to Manu, his son, and Manu is considered the father of mankind. So that's why in Sanskrit, a man is called Manav, which means one who comes from Manu.
It's interesting, the word man is so connected to Manu. Yeah.
That's true. And Manu in turn instructed it to his son Ikshvaku, and Ikshvaku is one of the ancestors of Lord Ramachandra. So that's how this knowledge has been coming down in this chain. And Krishna is mentioning that this Bhagavad-Gita that he's telling Arjuna right now is not like a new science, or it's like not a new philosophy. Krishna already had instructed the same knowledge to Vivaswan millions of years ago, and it's coming down in that chain. Evam parampara praptam imam rajarshyo vidu Sakalaneha mahata yogunashta parantapa.
Yes, Gunjan and Ashwin, we saw it. As soon as we do our stop share, then we'll first put you in before that. So just give
This
us
supreme science was thus received through the chain of disciplic succession, and the saintly kings
understood it in that way.
But in due course of time, the succession was broken, and therefore the science as it appears to be lost.
So this is actually, let's first finish it and then we'll.
Okay.
So this is actually what we are going to talk about today. This idea of this chain of disciplic succession, or how knowledge is transmitted as according to the Vedic system. So in this verse, Krishna is saying that this supreme science is always received through this particular chain, but then and the saintly kings, and so the kings were actually they were not ordinary kings; they were called Raja Rishis, which means that they would rule, but then they were really very saintly, right? Very trained up to actually give it up when the time came. But somehow or the other, as it happens because of the effect of time, that succession got broken, and therefore sometimes what happens, the science actually gets lost. So we'll discuss this more in our presentation today. What is this disciplic succession and how it works?
Saivayam mayate adya yoga prokta puratanaha bhaktosi me sakha cheti rahasyam hi etaduttamam.
That very ancient science of the relationship with the Supreme is today told by me to you, because you are my devotee as well as my friend, and can therefore understand the transcendental mystery of this science.
So Krishna is saying that he is re-establishing that chain, unbroken chain, again with Arjuna, because it was broken, and he's giving the qualification for a person to be in that link or in that chain, is that one is a friend and is a devotee of Krishna, because this transcendental knowledge is a mystery, and if one has a challenging attitude or doesn't have that friendly attitude towards Krishna, then they cannot realize this transcendental knowledge. They may know about it in an academic way, but they will not be able to realize this knowledge.
Should we start there?
Yeah.
Okay. So now we'll send both of you into the breakout room. Ashwin and Gunjan. Okay. So as we are, these are very key concepts. So while we are discussing it, so please feel free to write your questions or realizations or reflections that we can take at the end. So we'll try to leave enough time for discussions. Okay. So it's okay. So the main thing, the first, we want to start by talking about how do we know anything, right? In this world, if you want to know something, then how do we know? So in Sanskrit, there is a field of study which is called Nyaya. And in Nyaya, there are different pramanas or evidences or different forms of evidence that are given. So there are, 3 that we are going to look at.
There are 10 that are given, but these 3 are very prominent and we can relate to them. In our day-to-day life also, we always use these methods to obtain knowledge about anything. So the first one is called pratyaksha, or direct sense perception. In Sanskrit, pratyaksha means something that is right in front of our eyes. So aksha means eyes and pratya means something in front. So in front of our eyes or in front of our ears, and then all the 5 senses basically. So that's called knowledge acquired through sense perception.
So one of the challenges, I guess we can talk about the challenges later.
But yeah, we can mention them.
We can just mention them that, it is described that some of the limitations of this kind of knowledge acquisition is that our senses are imperfect. We are prone to making mistakes. We also get illusions sometimes. And then the fourth is that in spite of having these limitations, we may still try to project ourselves as being all-knowing. So these are
or present the knowledge as definitive.
Then the second one is speculation or Anuman Praman. So Anuman Praman is the second way, which is basically taking in all the different sensory perception, the data from the senses, and then putting it together and trying to conjecture, right? Using the mind and the mental faculty to come up with different scenarios and conclusions based on those imperfect data that we are receiving.
And the problem with this method is, it's not that this is completely faulty, but the problems with this method is our mind is imperfect, right? It has its own prior biases or experiences, conceptions of things. So that is imposed, is always mixed with our speculation, or plays a role in coming up with that speculation or conjecture. And the problem there is that thinking that the conjecture or speculation is the reality. That's where the problem lies.
And then the third is Shabda, or expert. So we'll talk a little bit more about that. That Shabda is actually, yes, we can say it's expert, but it is more than that. It is spiritual sound. I think we talked about this in our yoga of sound, that this is spiritual sound that descends, and then we can, just by accepting it, then we can actually save time. And the fact is that it has a way that we can actually test that knowledge, that knowledge by direct sense perception.
So Shabda Praman, which means getting the knowledge from a reliable source like an expert. And therefore we avoid the challenges from the previous two methods, which is sense perception and speculation.
So here is this neuroscientist, David Eagleman, and he talks about this limitation of human perception. And he talks about how each one of us, we have what's called the Umwelt factor, where we have a very narrow window, right? Which is our world. And this is what we perceive. So we can watch this briefly.
I'm going to start by talking about the future of being human by going back to a quotation from 1670 from Blaise Pascal, who pointed out that man is equal.
Just 1 second, this technical glitch here. Then I don't know how this
equally incapable
Just 1 second.
of seeing what's happening.
It doesn't allow you to. Okay, yeah. So this is where we start.
Through your body is NPR and CNN and gamma rays, X-rays, and microwaves, all kinds of things that are completely invisible to you, even though it's the same stuff. Now, why is it invisible to you? Because you don't have specialized biological receptors for picking up on it. So as far as you're concerned, it doesn't even exist. Now, it turns out that not all animals are limited to the same range we are. So, for example, snakes see in the infrared range, so they can see a little bit farther out than we can. And honeybees see in the ultraviolet range, and bees and flowers communicate with each other this way in this range that we can't see. And of course, we build machines in the dashboards of our cars to pick up on radio waves, and we build machines in hospitals to pick up on X-rays and things like that. But we can't see any of that stuff. And so what we're able to experience, what your human experience is delimited by, are the biological receptors that you happen to come to the table with. Isn't that stunning? So it turns out that every animal, as you look across the animal kingdom, has their own window on reality. And the reason is they have different biological receptors. So for the blind world of the tick, the signals that it gets from its ecosystem are heat and the odor of butyric acid. Those are the signals that it's picking up on to figure out what its world is. And for the black ghost knifefish, what it's picking up on is electrical fields. That's what it's getting from its ecosystem. And for the blind echolocating bat, it's air compression waves. And the key is that these are all the signals that it gets. And we have a word for this in science. This little window of your reality based on what you can pick up on is called the Umwelt, which is a German word that means the surrounding world. And the really stunning part is that somehow all of us, presumably animals and so on, imagine that our Umwelt is the entire objective reality out there.
So this is one of the limitations with.
So for example, in the Truman Show,
So this is, as we can see, is the limitation of just getting knowledge from direct sense perception, right? That it is, as you can see, we have a very limited window of perception. And the next video that we are going to watch is, just give us 1 minute. We just had a little technical glitch, so just give us one. And so the next one that we are going to talk about is using the mind. And that's something that's very common. Actually, most of the knowledge that we get are actually based on these first two, right? The direct sense perception, and the second one, which is conjecture or speculation, right? Coming up with different ways of understanding what we have gotten from our senses. And so just... So there is a limitation even of logic. It's not shared.
So because we think that we are logical, rational people, and then that I can solve any problem through logic. But this experiment actually shows the limitation of logic. This professor from NYU, he ran an experiment, and then also a lot of common people actually participated in this experiment. And his conclusion was that he called it like cognitive impenetration, which means you can't logic your way out of. Like the way we see things, our perception actually really collides with the logic, and you can't really reason out of that logic.
Because that's the other thing, is that yes, my senses are imperfect. Yes, my perception is off. But if I know about it, right, so then I should be able to rationalize it and have a different experience. So according to this is actually a place that I think they have in New York, where people actually visit, and you'll see it's quite an amazing room that they have created.
Basically, it shows that logic is not sufficient to understand reality.
So the room here, actually everything is in 90-degree angle, right?
Behind that glowing hallway is a really cool art exhibit. But don't take my word for it. Michael Landy has a Ph.D.
I'm a professor of psychology and neuroscience at NYU.
Anyway, see for yourself.
What's interesting to me about this piece as a perceptual scientist is that it demonstrates things that I find fascinating about perception. That perception is always an interplay between information that you're getting immediately from your senses and prior knowledge that you use to interpret that information. And when those match, the system works really well.
And when they mismatch, you get a very confusing experience that a lot of people seem to enjoy. When the exhibition was in LA, it drew
somewhere between 17,000 and 25,000, but yeah, a bunch.
That's artist Julian Hober, and his relation to this work?
How the apparatus works. This is an experience you can't logic your way out of.
The fancy phrase people use is they're cognitively impenetrable. You can know that what you are perceiving is wrong, but you'll still perceive it that way.
You can call it a trick or you can call it an illusion, but it's completely transparent. It's not a trick. It's that depending on the context you're in, your entire experience of the world can be altered, not through fact or fiction, but position.
That is, our experience of the world depends not on what is true, but on what we perceive to be true. On the other hand, Michael Landy says, our perceptual system is usually on the mark.
Is it necessarily subjective? Well, it's inside you. That's kind of the definition of subjective. Is it veridical? Does it reflect what the world really is? Well, most of the time it's pretty close to veridical.
I guess you could see it.
So here we can see that our mind has the logic is based on our previous experiences of this world. And our perception is constantly interfering with logic. So logic is not sufficient to understand reality.
So this is another very famous, story. Our kids actually did a drama on this as well, which is what happens when you're trying to understand something. Say, these are the 6 blind men who go and they try to touch an elephant, right? And they're trying to figure out what an elephant is. And so as they're touching different parts of the elephant, they're getting different experiences. And so they're, when asked, okay, what's an elephant? Somebody says, well, to me, it looks like it's a snake. And somebody else says it looks like a tree. And then somebody else holds the tail and says it looks like a rope to me. And so, one can keep fighting with each other based on all these different perceptions, which are all correct, but it does not constitute the entire picture.
And the reason we sometimes have to take shelter of this way of acquiring knowledge is because our senses don't have enough information, right? And when these blind men, they finally get to a person who can see, then the person is able to explain to them what this creature is, and he explains to them this is an elephant. So they need the help of a person who can actually see.
And so this is another story that our teacher, Prabhupada, would often use to demonstrate that, just like we heard, from this neuroscientist, how we have this very narrow window of perception, but we like to believe that, our world that we see is the objective reality. So same thing with this frog. That he stays in this well, and he thinks this is all there is to the world. So we want to tell the story before? And so there is this another frog that comes from the Pacific Ocean.
Yeah, this frog has a guest, and he tells them, I'm visiting from Pacific Ocean. So this frog in the well asks him, how big is the Pacific Ocean? And then we will see what happens to him. So in the end, he keeps, let's see, so it starts from 30.
What is this Atlantic Ocean? It is a vast body of water. How vast? Is it twice the size of this well? Oh no, much larger. How much larger? 10 times the size? Oh no, much larger. 20 times the size? 30 times?
So like this goes on, and this Dr. Frog, he keeps on like trying to estimate the size. He keeps pumping up his body,
So it's this big, and then he goes this big, and then he goes this big, and it says that finally he just explodes because there is no way his tiny brain can even conceive that there can be a Pacific Ocean. Right?
So here we can see that how his logic was not wrong. I mean, he was perceiving in terms of 3 times, 10 times of the well, and that's how we progress. But he had no conception of how big can the Pacific Ocean be. So I guess in these situations where our conjecture, our hypothesis, and our sense perception doesn't work, we all need help of experts to perceive reality or understand what's going on.
So this particular slide that we want to show you, this little clip, it's a short clip, is actually, there's a little bit of an irony there because this guy here, Richard Dawkins, is actually the poster boy of empirical science and reason. And he's talking about getting knowledge, that we need experts and we need to rely on authority.
We can't depend on our own.
Among them out, and they did, by a very narrow margin. This cult of everybody being an expert, all opinions being equally valid, is, I think, dangerous and most unfortunate. And of course, I have been accused of being an elitist because of this. And yes, I mean, when you're about to have an operation, you want an elite surgeon to cut you open. You want an elite anesthetist to put you under. When you're about to fly, you want an elite pilot to fly you. When you're about to leave a...
Okay.
So this is what it is. I mean, we have to, in different aspects of our life, we need to take advantage of experts in that area.
And we do that in, very intuitively. We always try to find a person who would know, because that, like we described, also saves us so much time. So we'll come to your questions and comments in the end. So keep putting them there.
And therefore, this the Vedas talk about this third kind of way of obtaining knowledge. It's called Shabda Praman, which is especially the knowledge about, in general, about the material universe, and also the knowledge about who we are, what is the reality. And this is called Shabda Praman because this is the transcendental sound that first manifests in the Muladhara Chakra of Brahma.
I think we talked about this in our yoga of sound, right? That there are different levels of sound. And so what we are talking about, if you guys remember that slide, was Paravak. Paravak is sound that does not belong to this material world, right? So go ahead. So then
it's injected into the Muladhara Chakra of Brahma as something that is not audible to the ears by Krishna. And then it goes up through as Pashyanti Vak in his Manipur Chakra, and then goes up further as Madhyama Vak to his Vishuddhi Chakra, and then finally it comes out of his mouth as Vaikari Vak, which is the different sounds of the Vedas. And the Vedas are not just spiritual sounds, but they are sounds that explain not just about the spiritual realm, but also everything about the material realm as well.
So just to back off a little bit, the way, I guess if those of you who might be wondering who Brahma is, so, there is a description of how creation happens in the Srimad Bhagavatam, where it's described that Lord Vishnu is lying down, and then from his bodily, as he inhales and exhales, so many universes come out, and as he inhales, then the universes come back in. So Brahma actually appears on a lotus flower from the navel of Mahavishnu. And so when he appears on this lotus, I think we have,
It's coming back. Yeah.
So that he's completely bewildered, and he's thinking like, where am I? And who am I? And what am I doing on this lotus? And then he starts to look around.
And this Shabda Brahma, the thing about this Shabda Brahma is this is knowledge that is coming from higher realms to the lower realms. And this is called the descending knowledge. It is not knowledge that somebody has experimented and created, but this is knowledge that is already known by the person who has created this universe, right? And all the universes, which is the Supreme Brahman, Krishna, and that he passes on that knowledge.
So in that state, Brahma actually receives this knowledge when he's thinking. So we'll talk about that story. It's coming up. But in the meantime, this is really an interesting thing that, how do we get this knowledge? So like we said, Brahma receives this knowledge from Krishna. I think this is a story that we need to tell right now so that we can understand. So Brahma is sitting on this lotus and he's thinking, who am I? Where have I come from? And so he tries to go down the stem of this lotus to see what is his origin. And obviously he cannot figure it out. And so then he hears two syllables. He hears the syllables ta and pa. And he puts them together. And the word tapa means penance and austerity. So he engages in in great penances for a long, long time. And when he does that, then he hears a flute sound of Krishna. And by hearing that flute sound, I guess we're just going to that slide. I think it's put in the wrong place here. So when he hears that flute sound, then that flute sound actually manifests as,
I think we'll just go back.
there it is. So that flute sound actually manifests as knowledge of the Vedas. And so,
In the beginning, Hindus.
So that knowledge that he receives is then passed on from him to his student and then to his student. So when we are saying Shabda Brahma, we're really talking about a chain of teachers who pass down this knowledge or who transmit this knowledge, starting from Krishna, then to Brahma, and then onwards.
So this chain, we find so many precedents of it in our day-to-day life, how something is passed on from one person to the other, and the sanctity of that object is maintained for that. So similarly, this spiritual knowledge is passed down in that chain. So we can look at it.
So, back in the day, during the time of the British Raj, there used to be these people called mail runners. And it's interesting because that's kind of what they did. They would take a mail and they would go off into the really, different places, and they would carry that mail. They would carry that message. So let's watch this, and then we'll talk about this idea of
So he's considered the last male runner in the modern times.
Rough terrain, right?
Their whole aim was to get the mail on time. So you have this, a story which is often told about a mail runner who was attacked by a tiger. But before he was killed, but he saw to it that there's another village chowkidar who could carry the mail to its destination. So there is a lot of lore around runners. In fact, even in the late 19th and early 20th century, there were articles which appeared in Science.
So this is actually quite amazing that how these mail runners would, face great difficulties, but they would make sure that this mail is delivered.
Delivered, yeah, as it is. And this is the same principle that applies in this spiritual disciplic succession or chain. And Prabhupada, who was the most recent link in that chain, he describes himself in that spirit that, let me just play this.
So maybe we can. Yeah.
And you can see whatever he's speaking is transcribed in the text there.
Acharati Shrestha. If you carry this message, it is not my message. It is the message of Krishna. I have not manufactured this message. I am imperfect. But I am presenting the perfect message. That is my business. I don't say I am perfect. I am simply carrier, peon. And a peon delivers a money at $1,000. It is not his money. He simply carries. So my business is to carry. Krishna's business, that's all.
So in this way, we can see, right, that how each link
maintains this mood that they're just a carrier. They don't really add or subtract to the message. They can explain the message in terms of the present situation with their own realization using the examples or whatever is going on, the events of the day, or to explain the language that the common people will understand. But they never add new conclusions or new findings because everything, this transcendental knowledge is coming down from the highest source. So there's nothing, in one sense, there's nothing new to be found. But the same knowledge is presented.
they may adjust according to the relevance, making it more relevant for the current times, but the principle has to stay intact, and that is the most important. So so maybe we can come back to this later. So it's okay, we can just talk about the trees. So this idea of trees, how they transport water, right? Or the idea of a seed, and then how the seed actually becomes a sapling and then becomes different branches, right? And then becomes this huge tree, is actually sort of how this knowledge actually expands.
It's like all the branches and all the leaves, they are all connected together. And that's what keeps them alive. And if any branch or leaf falls off or disconnects from the tree, then it dries up. And that's what Krishna is talking about, that this chain dried up because that branch got separated. And so it's very important to keep the sanctity of the branch.
Also, when they're talking about, we're not going to watch it right now, it's too many, but when the water is actually going through, and you can actually, in this video, you'll be able to see how the water actually goes through the tree system. Then it's described that how the bark is very thick, so that the water is not lost as it goes through it, right? So in the same way, as this message is transmitted from Krishna to Brahma and then progressing downwards, then the idea is that this bark can be actually symbolic of a check and balance system that is inherent in this disciplic succession, which is the check and balance system, which we can talk about in detail later, is Guru, Sadhu, and Shastra, which technically, which translates basically as all of these three things have to be in agreement with each other.
So like the tree's roots, they represent in one sense this root of this knowledge. and the Vedas and the scriptures. That's the root of this knowledge. And the bark that represents like the sadhus and the guru, which protects this knowledge from getting contaminated or dried up.
And ultimately, the water actually comes from Krishna, right? So that water which is flowing is actually the word of Krishna.
Right.
It's quite a fascinating video because you can actually see, how the water.
And this is another way Prabhupada gives the example quite often, that how electricity is transmitted. It's when we look at a plug in our house, we never think about it. We just plug in any appliance, and then the appliance works. But to bring that electricity from where it's coming, a powerhouse, is quite a feat. And it requires so many transmission lines, and it requires so many transformers. So one of the key concepts is that to transport this electricity over long distance, a lot of electricity is lost as heat when it transmits in the wire. So what they do is they use a step-up transformer, which is closer to the powerhouse, and they pump up the voltage at very high voltage. And as a result, the current that is flowing in the wire reduces, and the heat loss also reduces quite a bit. And then when it comes closer to our house, there is a step-down transformer which transforms the voltage, brings the voltage down, and so that we can use it. And this is what this chain, this spiritual chain, is doing. That's Krishna is like the powerhouse, and these transformers and the wires and all these are like the chain in the disciplic chain, and the gurus in that chain who are taking that knowledge, making it available to us so that we can understand it.
And depending on who we are speaking to,
Right.
sometimes we may step it up or we may step it down.
Right.
And we see that across the world, there are so many teachers, and they're speaking this knowledge in different places according to the level of the people. And sometimes they may give a part of it, and sometimes they may not. Like, for example, when Buddha came, he spoke essentially of the principle of nonviolence, because that was the call of the hour, because people were misusing the Vedas to actually indiscriminately kill. So when the messengers come, they may focus on one aspect depending on the need of the culture and the people that they're speaking with.
And the stepping up also kind of represents the purity. Because of the purity, they are able to carry this knowledge for long distances in terms of distance as well as time. And this is another one that it's like we know from our day-to-day life, how when evidence is found at a crime scene, they have to accurately maintain the chain of custody. And if the chain of custody is kind of messed up, then the evidence becomes useless. So similarly, this knowledge is passing through this chain of disciplic, and it's maintained to keep the sanctity of the knowledge.
So this human chain is actually a chain that is started by Krishna. Then it is like we described it, Lord Brahma receives this knowledge. So there are 4 such chains, and we belong to the chain that comes down from Lord Brahma.
So we'll describe those chains, but this is like another example of how this dog is going to die in this canal, and this person is trying to save him, but then he realizes he can't do it by himself. So he needs help, and then we'll see what happens next.
Turn on the music. So this idea this is actually Krishna's chain, to actually rescue each person who's also drowning in this vast ocean. And so Krishna sends all these different teachers who can come and who can pull us out, and it forms a chain.
So there are these 4 spiritual chains that Krishna has started since the universe was created. And in one chain, Krishna gives the knowledge to Brahma. In another chain, he starts the knowledge from Lakshmi, who is his counterpart. Another chain, he starts the knowledge with Lord Shiva. And the 4th one, he starts with Kumaras. And each of these chains, they transmit the same message, but in a way, there are slight differences, but more to attract people at different times and different places and different contexts. But the conclusion is the same. And in each of these sampradayas, they're called sampradaya, which means which provides complete knowledge.
And therefore, like you can think of them as like 4 schools. And each one of these 4 schools, they're started by Krishna. So we belong to the first school.
The Brahmas and the prominent teachers there are mentioned here, like Madhavacharya, Chaitanya, Prabhupada. They are, oh, okay, they're already at 32. So maybe we can finish this next.
Yeah, we can finish this
on Wednesday, actually.
Yeah, Wednesday we are going to actually continue because it's Prabhupada's appearance day. So we want to talk about, we were also planning to talk about spiritual leadership.
Yeah.
And as part of discussing this parampara, we'll bring it together. And on Wednesday, we'll continue this discussion. So we'll take your questions. Naji has some thoughts here. Let's start. I think. You go up.
Does cheating appear as a bias in speculation? Yeah, that's like a when somebody is unconscious of their bias, or we just do it because we have a bias, then it's not like direct cheating, but sometimes people are aware of they have a certain agenda and certain point they want to prove, and they disregard the bias.
If one receives darshan of Sri Krishna, does that mean that one's umvelt is the complete whole? Yes. As soon as we receive, as soon as we connect with the complete whole, then our perception of the world, and this is what Prabhupada talks about, is changing our narrow conception or narrow window of perception and making it into what's called in Sanskrit Shastra Chakshu. Shastra Chakshu means being able to see through the lens of this particular, this body of knowledge, right?
And Krishna is called Rishikesha, which means he's the master of senses. So when we get fully connected with him, then Krishna can reveal to us whatever needs to be known. Krishna says in the Bhagavad-Gita that by this transcendental knowledge, you can know everything. And Krishna can, because he's the universe, he's the source of the universe, he can let us know anything that we want to learn about this universe or beyond. Perception, Anshul is asking, perception also depends upon your emotions. We have so many times that same words can mean different to us based on our mental state, emotions that particular time, and our perception of what that. So yeah, emotions play a big role in our perception.
There are so many different versions, translations, explanations available for our scripture. How to make sure we are following the true version, because books can also be dependent on the perception of the writers. But a very good question, Anshul. And again, this is why that, when Prabhupada is speaking, he's not just representing his own ideas, but he's really trying to present the message that has been passed down through thousands of years through this particular chain of knowledge. And so that's how we know. And one of the ways that you can test is you can actually go down that line and you can look at the writings of the previous teachers and see how they are in harmony.
And these teachers are not just ordinary people who just decided to write books, but they have completely purified themselves and linked themselves to Krishna, and they get revelation. But at the same time, they preserve this knowledge by passing it on from their guru and the chain of the gurus. And therefore, they maintain the sanctity, and it is beyond, that knowledge is not affected by their emotions or biases or perceptions that they have. And therefore, the knowledge is maintained.
So our presentation is over now, so we can maybe take some reflections if you don't have any questions. Our senses are limited. Maybe they're limited for a reason, maybe because that way how much we can handle, maybe it's Krishna's handle. Yeah. This is the way it is in the material world, our senses are just limited. So
and then that is the nature of material life, that everything is limited here, not just our senses, but everything, right? Our lifespan is limited. How much we can eat is limited. Everything is limited. But in spiritual realm, everything becomes unlimited. So the spiritual senses, they can have unlimited happiness. We can have unlimited knowledge. Our happiness is unlimited. So that's the nature of spiritual realm.
Thank you, Deidre. Did you have any reflection you wanted to share before you left? Or is the supreme knowledge known as Brahma Gyan? Yes. This is right?
Yeah, Brahma Gyan means knowledge of the absolute truth.
Go ahead. We often feel bad about things in life. What is happening when we feel bad? So the reason there's so many things that could be happening. We may feel bad because we are not in sync with our true nature. So that's one reason that sometimes we feel this sort of unease, and we feel that we are not really connected. And that's kind of what Arjuna is also feeling, right? He's feeling sort of bad, like things are not right, even though he has found himself in this place after so much deliberation, but it still doesn't feel right. So generally, when these kind of things happen, the society at large will just tell us to just move on, or just we try to distract ourselves with so many things. But the Bhagavad Gita actually wants us to follow this thread of unease and see how this can actually take us maybe to a deeper place of connection. And in general, just like when we have fever, then it generally means that there is something going on, that needs to be brought back into a state of balance. So that's one way to think about feeling bad. If you have anything specific, sometimes it's also unmet expectations, right? Because we have a certain perception of how life should be, and when it doesn't turn out that way, then also we may feel bad. But at the heart of it, it is always this disconnect between the ultimate reality and this projected reality.
And we are also affected by the gunas, the mode of passion and the mode of ignorance. And mostly the mode of passion and ignorance, they toss us around, and then our perception of feeling bad usually comes from those two gunas. And the goodness is basically light, feeling light, and being in light and happiness and knowledge.
I hope that helps, Sid. Thank you.